Welcome back to Stories of Becoming, a podcast from Reconciling Ministries Network, sharing the real stories of people and communities living into God's inclusive love. Today's episode is called The Church We Dreamed Of, and we're going to go back, like all the way back, to the early days of the Reconciling movement. Back before there were brochures and back before there was policy language to even fight, back before something called RMN even existed. We're going to talk today about the dream that queer United Methodist and allies carried long before anybody imagined that General Conference vote in 2024. And I'm joined today by three people who are not just part of the story, but they are the story. Reverend Beth Richardson, whose time at Edge Hill United Methodist Church back in 1979 helped shape the very movement that we live in. Mark Bowman, one of the co-founders of the Reconciling congregation program and the early strategic organizer, and Reverend Dr. Pamela Lightsey, scholar, pastor, longtime queer Black activist who helped give the movement a theological depth and prophetic edge. Together, we're going to be remembering where we came from, and we're going to explore what it means to keep becoming the church we dreamed of. Let's dig in. Okay, before we begin, I just want to say this out loud. You three are superstars. Every one of you has been doing this work, and I know we all stand on the shoulders of those who've come before us. But for me, and for many of us in this movement right now, you are the shoulders that we're standing on. So I want to say thank you. Thank you for what you carried. Thank you for what you have risked and continue to risk. And thank you for what you dreamed many, many years ago that made all of this possible. I want to start at the very, very beginning. Before there was strategy or organizing, before RMN had a name, before we were an organization, there had to be a longing. And so when you think back to the earliest stirrings of this movement, whenever that was for you, either in the church or in your own life, what was the moment when you first realized that the church was not yet the church that you had told it could be, or wasn't yet the church that you were dreaming of? And how did that realization of, oh, the church isn't there yet, stir something deep within you to resist or to change or to begin to dream? Let's see. Mark, we're going to start with you, I think.
Thank you, Julia. It's a treat to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and share. I was in seminary in Boston in the late 1970s. I came out during seminary and at that time engaged with Affirmation, which is the United Methodist Lesbian Gay Caucus at that time. This is 1979, leading up to the General Conference in Indianapolis in 1980. I had planned to go there to be part of the Affirmation witness, and I was reading the news about MFSA and Board of Church and Society and all these great proposals for opening the church and the things the church could do better. And I kind of went there with a lot of energy about what this General Conference was going to do to change things. And of course, got there, and all those proposals came before the General Conference and were voted down very heavily. And that was frankly a very crushing experience. The overwhelming negative votes, which continued for many more General Conferences, but this was 1980. My quick reflection on that, I was informed by, in seminary, reading Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, that talks about change happens from the bottom up. Long-term change is grassroots. And as I reflected on what was happening in the United Methodist Church, the way we were going to make change was through a long-term commitment to organize change at the grassroots level, the congregational level.
Brilliant. Yeah, exactly. I think that book has changed the lives of so many people. What about you, Dr. Lightsey?
Well, for me, my experiences are beyond the United Methodist Church. I only became a member of the United Methodist Church in 1991, but I grew up in what many people would consider a queer community. We had a lot of LGBTQ folk in my community. We weren't using that acronym at the time. My brother was a gay man, a musician who subsequently, he died of complications related to HIV/AIDS. He died in the early 90s. And I was really torn about that. We were living in Europe. My family was living in Europe at the time. The Pentecostal church that I was a part of was really harsh on queer folk. And I didn't like that at all because my brother had been just my joy. We had so much, we were close and we had so much fun together. And the church was really trying to teach me how to denounce my brother. And I didn't like that. I didn't think that was right. When my brother died, it was really life-changing experience for me. When I came back to America, I joined the United Methodist Church. And I joined the church in 91, the same year my brother died. And in 1992, there was a general conference. And one of the conversations stirring in our local church was about the church voting yet again, so they said, about gay rights. And I was curious about that because I'd hoped that the church would really be a place that would regard all people as equal and sacred. And what I was hearing from the church was a lot of bigotry. I was going through my own personal dilemma at the time. And so my own personal dilemma was really going through divorce. I'd been trying to hold on to this kind of heterosexual relationship when that relationship wasn't trying to hold on to me. And so after divorcing and beginning to go to seminary, I really, really was able to kind of begin to shake some of the bigotry that I had been taught, particularly because I went to the Interdenominational Theological School in Atlanta, which was really, really standing really strong on Black liberation theology. And so that theology, womanist theology, is really what pushed me into really taking a stronger stance for LGBTQ rights.
That's excellent. Thank you for your answer. And I'm sorry about your brother. I didn't know that part of your story. Beth?
Thank you. And it's so good to be here with you all. Well, I didn't come out until I was in college, and I had grown up in Oklahoma. My dad was a Methodist pastor, and I always thought I would be, in the church. Before I knew there were women pastors, I thought I would have to marry a pastor. I couldn't imagine, not being at the church all the time. And so I was on that track and came out during college and thought, okay, well, church isn't going to want me. And right after college, and this was in 1979, I moved to Nashville and I started attending Edge Hill United Methodist Church. And I got this glimpse of how the church could be. I didn't know that there would be churches that would be welcoming to all folks, including queer people. And so like September, I landed at Edge Hill, and then later that fall, I went to my first affirmation meeting in Indianapolis. So Mark and I were coming into the movement about the same time. And that same general conference in 1980, I went with so much enthusiasm that if these folks could just meet us, they would love us and everything would be fine. And then the vote happened, and I think what was happening for me at that time was we had a couple of church historians amongst our number, and they said, hey, y'all, it's probably going to take 50 years. It took a long time for the church to change on these other issues. This is going to take a long time. And what happened in my heart, in my compassionate heart, was thinking about, what about all those folks out in those little churches everywhere? How are they going to make it 50 years? We've got to be able to minister to them. And so a lot of the passion that I had for what became the Reconciling movement was thinking about that long term. What are we going to do to care for our people during all of those years, until the rules can actually change. So I was getting from Edge Hill like a glimpse of how it could be, right when I was getting the glimpse of how it is from the institution.
Yeah. So Beth, Mark, were both of you, like the musical, were you both literally in the room where it happened? I mean, like in September 1982, affirmation meeting in Boston, I think it was DJ Porter and Perry Wiggins were both of you in that room when everybody said, we got to figure out a movement and we got to figure out some things? Or was it simply like the movement's already started and here's what we have to add to it? Or those sort of things? Those are the questions I'm kind of asking.
I don't remember whether I was in the room. I was at the meeting where we talked about it, but we had all these different subcommittees. So I don't remember what I was actually working on at that time. But one of the things that was true for affirmation at that time was that we always had co-leadership. It was and it was very binary. So we always had a man and a woman leading. And when it came time for us to say who's going to lead this new movement, Mark and I said, sure, we'll do it.
Did you both raise your hands, or did Beth raise her hand and you drug over Mark? How did that?
Actually don't. I was in the committee. It was Perry and DJ and I were assigned at the previous meeting to come up with a proposal to bring to this meeting. So I was on the task force. So I put a lot of time and energy. Probably I was the one who drove that trio to get the report ready to bring. And so, but I don't remember if Beth and I just looked across the room and our eyes lit up and we said, I don't quite know how that connection had happened, but the connection was incredibly rich. We had the most incredible symbiotic relationship, and our gifts and our energies just came together. That was just really critical. It was divinely ordained, I can only say, that got it going in those early years.
Okay. Beth, did you leave the church you were at to go do this new thing?
No, I was actually in seminary at that time, and I recently found, Mark, I need to send this to you, like a report for the board, and I think we made like, $1,000 that year, you and I. I mean, it was just like maybe $50 a month or something. So it wasn't like a job, right? It was the other stuff we did. So I was in seminary and I was cleaning houses and I was, and Mark, what were you doing in those days for your?
I was doing a variety of different kinds of part-time work too. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we began as volunteers for the first year or two, and then very, very part-time, and then a little more part-time, but it wasn't until, I think, 1990 or after that it became a full-time position. So it was many years in developing.
Okay. So the 80s, things are developing. We have a decade, and then we have Dr. Lightsey's intersection with the movement. Many of us know you as the leading voice of womanist queer theology and LGBTQ justice in the church, but we don't always know the beginning of that story. And I know you talked a little bit about your journey into United Methodism, but what did it first look like? Can you tell our listeners the story of when you were invited to be a part of this reconciling movement?
Sure. I think it was the early 2000s. I had moved to Chicago to pastor a church on the south side of Chicago. At the same time, I was working on my PhD at Garrett, and I was contacted by Troy Plummer, who was then the ED of Reconciling Ministries Network. I met Troy at conversation that was developed with bishops in the room and leading scholars in the room to talk about a judicial council decision. I'm forgetting the name of it. It might have been 1032 or something like that, where the council had decided that even members who were queer could be justifiably, their membership could be taken from them. And so we gathered to talk about the consequences of that decision, to speak about theology in light of that decision. And so I got to meet some really good people at that meeting. And from that meeting, Troy and I connected. And it was later that Troy asked me, do you want to join the board of Reconciling Ministries Network? Now, when he asked me, I was still in the closet. So I was on the board of Reconciling Ministry, and I was still in the closet. I don't think I remember the general conference where Bishop Talbot was really pleading with the delegates not to once again vote in such a horrible way against the LGBTQ community. Now that might have been that was before 2012. I think that was 2008. I'm pretty sure it was 2008. And so by 2009, I was out, and I was, I was working at Garrett as a dean of students. So in the early 2000s, I started with RMN, went to work at Garrett in 2007, 2008. Bishop was Bishop Talbert's, speech on the floor. And I think a lot of people were arrested at that time. And I was just weeping in my office about the indignities that were going on at General Conference. And I made up in my mind, if this straight Black bishop could come out, then I need to come out the closet too. And so that's when I really, really started really working hard with Reconciling Ministries and the people in the movement.
Yeah, I'm just struck, first of all, by I think one of my very first meetings at Candler when I was in seminary, which would have been 2006. I was at a table. It was called the Sacred Worth Group, and I was invited to go, and we were supposed to go around the room and introduce ourselves. And for whatever reason, I was the second person they called on, and I did not know that we were going to be required to add pronouns behind our names or to identify which part of the group. And so I was like, I'm Julia Buckner. I'm an ally. And I was just like, please, God, go to the next person down the list, because I was not yet ready to name and claim anything for myself in that regards. So I think we've all been there. I'm thinking about, and granted, it all took us, each of us has a different story about this, but I'm thinking about how bold you all were. Mark, do you and Beth remember that general conference that Dr. Lightsey's referring to? Were people indeed arrested? I mean, was there fear in the air? Was there hope in the air? What was that like for the both of you?
Well, can I go back to the origin story?
Yes,
I
of
think it's
course.
important to sort of get this in here. This is a story I've told so many times in my life. So it's the General Conference in Baltimore in 1984. Affirmation was there. Beth and I had organized Reconciling congregations in 1983 and started talking to people and meeting in some churches and doing some work. But it was at the General Conference in Baltimore in 1984, which once again reaffirmed overwhelmingly the vote about practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching, and for the first time added an explicit ban on the ordination of lesbian and gay folks. So that was 1984. The last morning of that general conference, early in the morning, outside the Civic Center, as the delegates were coming in, members of Affirmation stood outside passing out flyers about, would you go back home and make a different kind of statement? Would your church be something new called a reconciling congregation? That was an act of faith. We passed out flyers. We had no idea if anyone would ever respond, if anything would happen. And within a month, we heard from two congregations, and symbolically, they were on both ends of the country: Washington Square Church in New York City and United Methodist Church in Fresno, California, voted to become reconciling. Remember, we didn't, Beth got letters. So Beth called me on the phone and said, Mark, we got this letter, because our P.O. box was in Nashville. And so we were like agog. Wow, it happened. We really have reconciling congregations. Now it's started.
I have a question about that. I have always wanted to ask y'all. Did y'all plan that on purpose to have one on the East Coast and one on you did plan it? No, you didn't plan it. You did not. These random two letters showed up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wesley, Washington Square was where Paul Abels was. They had a long history of just activism. And frankly, everybody goes agog about Wesley and the Methodist Church in Fresno, California. Why? Don Fado was the pastor. Don, who has recently died, unfortunately, is one of their long-term allies in Northern California. And Don came home from that general conference and said, folks, we've got to do this. And so that's how Wesley Fresno became a reconciling congregation.
Okay, so now I appreciate that interlude back to how we got here, but now come back up to the general conference that Dr. Lightsey's talking about, or you can stay at that earlier one you're talking about where you're handing out the pamphlets. I mean, you were bold, and I'm wondering when you were handing out that literature, or Dr. Lightsey, when you were standing there, you said you were weeping in your office. What did that feel like? Give us just a quick insight into, Was it scary? Did you say, like, forget the fear, I'm going to do this anyway? I mean, what were some of the emotions that were happening around you?
Well, for me, it was, I'm going to do it even if I'm afraid. People had been arrested prior to that time. Mark and Beth, you all will remember Bishop Sprague, who had been he had been arrested at one of the general conferences. I actually ended up being a clergy person. The first annual conference that I served at after seminary in the Chicago area, Bishop Sprague was our bishop. And so he had already set for me a standard of excellence when it came to speaking up and speaking out and with the possibility of being arrested. As I looked at, as the years moved on, I looked at Bishop Talbert. I was just like, oh, wow. Look at, the bishops are doing this. Some of the bishops are doing this. Not all of the bishops are doing this. I just didn't feel like I had the luxury to be quiet. You should also know that prior to my work in Reconciling Ministries Network, I grew up during the civil rights era. So I'm a Black Power baby. I grew up participating in Black Power protests. So being an activist was not new to me. Being an activist for LGBTQ folks was new to me. I had been an activist for Black people's rights, and I had been also an activist for women's rights. I was one of the first women who, I was a young baby preacher. I answered the call to ministry when I was 19 and was just talked about by so many men. So I was accustomed to being an activist. I was not yet accustomed to being an activist for my own particular rights as a queer person. So this was just another layer of the work that I had already been doing.
Yeah, that's really important for people to know.
So I was, I had already known the church wouldn't take me. So I was like jumping into this with all my heart. And partly I think, young people don't know what you can't do, right? So you just do it because it's the thing that you're supposed to do. And that's what we were up to. But sometime, I guess, in around 1980, I got a job at the Upper Room. And I had a couple of years there of overlap where I was working for Reconciling and the Upper Room. And I got afraid. In those era, there were staff people of the agencies who were getting fired when they came out. And so I have to say, and I'm trying to make amends to myself now in retirement, that I went back into the closet there for a while and tried to be a good gay. And even in my head, I signed all my writing at the Upper Room with Beth Richardson, and thinking that people didn't know that was the same person of Beth Richardson who was reconciling. And, it was like years until my wife says, honey, everyone knows. And I was like, what? It's the things that we do to protect our psyches, so that fear, that, part of it's that internalized homophobia that made me step back from being as active, and it made me want to protect the institution that I was working for. So it is so delightful. Thank you for this invitation to talk, because for all those years I didn't tell the story, and I'm just so pleased that I can be participating now in telling those stories. I can't remember what the original question was.
You're fine. You answered it. You were talking about the emotions behind it all. I think, Mark, I'll give you just 30 seconds here. But for all of us looking at you, right, you're in the movement. You're the loud, gregarious. You like to explain all the things. I'm like, oh my gosh, Mark Bowman. Were you ever scared?
I don't know that I would use the word scared. It helped that I was an optimist by personality type. So I always knew that we were going to win. And I put myself in a position where I had nothing to lose. I did not fear because of the position that I was in. The painful part was all the people around us who left, who could not continue on. And that was continual. People, the church is doing this to me. People whom I just thought, these are incredible people. They're great allies. I'm going to work together with them. And they said, sorry, I cannot stay in this painful situation anymore. And that happened constantly.
Yeah, we had some guests last week on the podcast who are now able to go through the ordination process and managed to stay. But I was recounting even as late as 2009, 2010, most of my colleagues around me were like, Julia, just leave the United Methodist Church, go over here somewhere else, and they will ordain you. And some forcefully so, very angrily, like, why aren't you leaving? So yeah, this may be too personal, but could you share, did your journey through this cost you anything?
I can answer that. I think the attacks, the constant attacks, watching friends be attacked also, it was just really, really, really hard. I remember in 2017, David Meredith being brought up on charges. You all will remember him being brought up on charges, and I served as co-counsel, Scott Campbell, to support David Meredith, and that was really, really hard for me. We did well. I mean, he was able to retire finally, but it was really, really hard for me to watch what the church was doing to people who were trying to do the right thing in their relationships. It was really hard. And the attacks that I got after I led the Black Lives Matter protest on the General Conference floor. Where was that? Where were we at? We were in Tampa, I think. We were in Tampa when that happened. And so it's just the attacks that took place, not just from within my own community, Black clergy, it's a hard thing to be attacked within your own community. That Black Lives Matter protest was actually at the 2016 General Conference in Portland. The Tampa conference was another crazy time.
I mean,
Yeah.
the cost for me was ordination. I was ordained deacon in 1982 in the East Ohio Annual Conference, finished seminary at Boston University School of Theology, went to General Conference in 84, was active with affirmation. But somehow I just thought, I am so good that they're just going to ordain me anyway, because how could they not, do that? And so I write my letter to go back asking for an appointment, which is the next step. And I get a letter back saying, wait a minute, we need to talk some more. So I was called back to what I call an inquisition-like committee, 7 white-haired white men in a room who wanted to know, was I a homosexual? That's what they wanted to know. And I had decided ahead of time that I could not lie, that I would tell the truth and do that. So at the time, of course, that was an incredibly crushing experience because my vocational intention was to be a clergy. And probably, and I don't say that with a lot of pathos, but it really was a very crushing experience. Hindsight, years later, I am so glad that happened because as a layperson, I've been able to do so much more than I would have had I been a clergy. So in some ways, I'm grateful. As painful as that was, I am grateful that change happened for me and enabled all sorts of new possibilities for me.
So I was at the upper room and was working for the church. I thought the church wouldn't want me, and then I was working for them. And at that time, the diaconal ministry didn't have anything in the discipline about us. And so I went ahead and started that process. And being so out at seminary, I got to the interview, and you know how you go through all the interviews and then usually you sit in this giant room all by yourself and wait. And the chairperson came out and said, well, we voted to approve you, but we want you to know that one of your seminary mates outed you, and we decided to approve you, but don't embarrass us. And so I'm only just now starting to realize how harmful that was, that I try, all of those years I was working so hard not to embarrass, the upper room or the church. And so a lot of the cost is internal. It's the wounding inside of me that I'll need to heal from. And I guess the other cost I just think is even friendships amongst us, as things got so hard in these last years that our coalition split up. And so I'm still having times of healing with some of my friends who went a different route, And I stayed closeted with all the privilege that came with that. I just pray, the wounding's not from us, it's from the church and from that stance that was taken. And I just pray for all of us to be healing from all of those years.
I think that is beautiful, Beth. I think, if you have just learned about RMN, you may see an email and you may think, oh, there's 1,400 different reconciling ministries, and there's over 46,000 reconciling United Methodists, but you don't really get a sense of just how brutal, and some of it internalized, but just how brutal those early years were for the people who were standing in the trenches doing this work. But as the movement continues, we got those 2 first letters, and that turned into 4 and 8, and it just kept growing. And it changed people. It changed annual conferences. It changed churches. It also changed expectations. And so I'm wondering, now Mark was always the optimist, but I'm wondering, Beth, for you, what is it, the earliest moment that you were like, oh my God, this could actually work? We could actually be affirming to folks who are in the LGBTQIA group. I mean, was there a first moment that you were like, by God, it's going to happen? And that may have been the vote in 2024, but maybe it was a first before then where you were like, this is a thing we can actually achieve.
Well, I was at Edchill, which was kind of reconciling before we had a program, just because of its history. But going down to the downtown post office and finding these letters, I didn't know there were other churches like Edchill. And I think that was one of the great, beautiful things that was happening, is that we discovered there were little pockets of reconciling people all over the place. And they probably were sitting there thinking they were alone too, And so that was, and then I think the second piece was our first convocation in Chicago, I think. And to get there, and I don't remember how many people there were, but it was just like, oh my goodness, look at all these people like us, and they're not all queer folks. There were straight folks who showed up too, And just the kind of the amazing time of being able to be there together with all these like-minded people let me know that there was hope, that things were going to change.
Yeah.
But I would just echo that. That was the birth of the movement. Before that, there really wasn't a movement. There were congregations scattered around the country. And Beth and I just said, well, if we have a party, do you think they would come? So in 1986, we put out a call, and 120 people showed up from about 20 to 22 different congregations in Chicago in February of 1987. And the spirit just was incredible. And that was the birth of the movement.
That's beautiful. Yeah. Thank you so much. As we near the end of our time together, one of the things I think about a lot, actually, is that just like our society is really, really segregated, still so are our churches. And one of the truths we have to admit and name out loud was the early movement was overwhelmingly white. And honestly, the United Methodist Church still remains deeply segregated. And so when you think back about your first experiences and I know this was 2 different decades for y'all, but how did you look back at the racial dynamics of the early movement? And what do you think intersectional justice requires of us now that maybe you didn't quite understand then, or you didn't dare yet hope for? Yeah. Beth?
This is so important, because we are not separate. We are one. And I'm so grateful that we are learning and realizing that we can't all stay in our camps. I was so fortunate to land at Edchill because it was the first interracial congregation in the Tennessee Conference to be interracial, and it was Black folks and white folks and folks that had worked in the civil rights movement. And 2 Sundays a month, we sang spirituals and had the choir led by Mrs. Marjorie Campbell from one of the high schools there. And then the other 2 weeks, it was folk songs, So really tried to kind of balance that out. Queer persons of color in the congregation at that time. It's I do have one story that came of hope in that time. We were celebrating Martin Luther King Sunday, and one of our Black folks, who was a wonderful singer, he sang a Holly Near song for that service. And so Holly Near was a part of women's music back in the 70s and 80s, and to have him sing that song there on MLK Day that was my vision of how it could all come together, how that intersectionality could come together.
I like that. Yeah. Dr. Lightsey?
Yeah,
I
a
know,
lot.
a lot to unpack there. What did the
Yeah,
church look like when you showed up? Or what did
it was
RMN
very
look?
white. It was very white. A lot of it was very white. I was, very, very happy to see people like Tracy West. I mentioned Bishop Talbert, and Don Guest later was doing a lot of good work. And so there were some Black folk that I could talk to. And so that was very, very helpful. Mark Miller, let us never forget to mention Mark Miller's name, was very, very fortunate to be able to have conversations with them. Also, um, Bishop Martin McLee, who was an ally, strong ally, and a dear friend, who, later died. And, I was really hurt when he died. But the fact that we had people like Mark Bowman. Mark, I don't even know if you remember the time that we came together in D.C., in Washington, D.C. And during that gathering in D.C., we decided there was a couple and they wanted to get married during that time. And I was able to officiate that marriage. And that was an interracial marriage, Black lesbian, white lesbian at the time. That was phenomenal for me. And it sparked, for me, I began to see far more participation of persons of color. When Ferguson took place, RMN actually paid some of the expenses for me to be down in Ferguson and sent part of the communications team. And we sat around the table on the board of RMN talking about intersectionality. We had some serious conversations, painful conversations too, about the work of RMN for LGBTQ persons who were, and that was some serious, you can have an entire broadcast on that one,
Yeah.
Julie, because that was a serious work.
The sociological reality is that the United Methodist Church is overwhelmingly white. The visible LGBT community is overwhelmingly white. So we were always dealing with that reality. So I took it as my responsibility, whenever possible, to allow the voices of queer people of color to be heard. Whenever possible, that was my responsibility to try to do. We started this magazine, Open Hands, and one of the very first issues was called Minorities Within a Minority. It was hearing the voices of queer people of color. And for that issue, I did an interview with Bayard Rustin that we published. So it was actually one of the last interviews that Rustin did. So it was a continual challenge all the time. When is it possible that we can provide forums and opportunities for queer persons of colored voices to be heard?
Yeah, I need to Google that and make sure I've seen that.
Hey,
So thank
Mark, give us a copy of that. I can use that. I can use that interview in my courses that I teach. Don't leave us without it, sir. So
It's
I'm looking
published
for
in
it.
Open Hands, which is available on the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network website. Yeah, the whole run of Open Hands magazine is available digitally, really lays out the history of the reconciling movement.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you, Mark. Thank you all for that. I think, we have talked about where we have been. We've talked a little bit that we're never going to get every deep dive into every moment of history, but I think it's important for people to know where we started from. And I want to end by asking, where do we still need to go? And so as you look at the United Methodist Church today, we are post-harmful language, but we're not yet healed, post-regionalization, but we're not yet decolonized. Where do you think the church's growing edges still exist? And what is the unfinished work that you hope little Mark Bowman and little Dr. Pamela Lightsey and little Beth, where do you think they are going to carry us forward? Dr. Lightsey, we'll go to you. I see you thinking.
Well, I'm in Chicago, and there have been ICE horrors going all around our city. And one thing that I've been thinking about a lot, I had this conversation twice today, is we need to really set aside some serious time for our clergy, our leaders, and those lay folk within our church to receive nonviolence training, in the Kingian nonviolence training. People want to participate. People want to stand up for their neighbors. Justice is really still a big issue. I'm glad that our church has dug in on the issue of the rights for our migrant neighbors. But we need training. We can't just be enraged in order to do the work we do. We can't just be angry. Beth talked about 50 years to bring about a change in the church. There was a lot of strategizing that took place. I was in some of those rooms when we were strategizing about what we were going to do during an upcoming general conference. We still need to strategize, and the church needs to make space for training people to be a voice for justice and equal rights. And we just have to pay more attention to the training than our own personal rage at what's going on.
Amen. Amen to that. I will sign up for any of that. Anybody else? Where do you think the church's growing edges are?
My heart has turned to the congregation for a number of years now, and I've really focused on the local church because I think that's the heart of where church is and where ministry happens. And so how do we enable our congregations to live multiculturally in justice and creative, community building and spirituality? So that's where I put my interest and energy and know that that's the struggle now. How do we enable congregations to live this out?
Yeah. All right. Local congregations. How about you, Beth?
I'm thinking I'm going to go with how do we keep the young folks from losing hope, especially with what's going on in the country right now. I was with some folks recently who were before that Supreme Court ruling last week. Folks of us who are older, I've been in my marriage without marriage equality, and I know that I can live through it if it goes back to that. But I'm really concerned about the young folks who have only known what we've had, and now it's being taken away. So I think just continuing to find ways for maybe local churches and the church to speak out to those tender hearts, to say, you are beloved and you're not alone, and we're going to get through this.
Very beautiful. Thank you. I want to thank you all three for joining us for this week's podcast. And in closing, one final question, or really we'll make it 2 parts, because sometimes this podcast can sound a little heavy with the stories of what you've walked through. What are you still becoming? So maybe something serious that you're still working on, but also what are you still becoming? Like you're going to become, I don't know, the best coffee pourer or the best pot roast maker or what are you still becoming, Mark?
My passion these days is sacred harp singing, old-fashioned shape note singing. I'm very active that here in Chicago and loving doing that.
That's wonderful. You may have to send us some recordings of that as well. Beth?
I'm working into art and been doing cartoons for years, but now more visual arts. I have a recent book out called Davida Angelica Roared, which is a children's story that I wrote in the 90s and then illustrated here in the last couple of years. So that's where my passion is right now.
Really cool. We want to see that as well. Dr. Lightsey?
Well, in 2 more years, I'll be retired. This is what I'm sharing with people. And so I need to learn from Mark and Beth how to be retired. My children don't think that I can do it, but I'm going to prove to them that I'm able to go and sit myself down somewhere and leave a great bit of this in the hands of really capable younger persons.
Dr. Lightsey is working towards full retirement. What's your course load like?
My course load right now is light, but there are the other things in my life that are real, because I want to study Python computer coding. So
Awesome.
I'm trying to.
Awesome. They
do
have
that.
all these cool apps for that.
Yes, there's a beginner's course that I'm starting.
Again, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We appreciate your time. Thank you. Stories of Becoming is a podcast from Reconciling Ministries Network, sharing the real stories of people and communities living into God's inclusive love. Through honest conversations about faith, courage, and transformation, we explore how the United Methodist Church and the people who call it home are being reshaped by grace. Be sure to like and subscribe on Spotify and YouTube, and we look forward to being with you next time.